What kind of advice do you have to homeowners?
Practicing that preparedness. Starting the conversation now is always going to be a benefit to any association out there.
And welcome to the Recovery Report Live, Global Pro's deep dive into relevant insurance topics, providing actionable takeaways and valuable insights. We aim to update, educate, and inform you weekly. I'm Dan Odess, president of Global Pro, where we manage risk to recovery. For more than a decade, we have represented thousands of business owners and community associations with the replacement of insurance and recovery of over $1 billion worth of loss. Today, we got a special broadcast. We have a special guest joining us today. Mr. Henry Dow of the Water Restoration Group has joined us today to talk to us a little bit about what's going on, things that we're experiencing here now and throughout the as we head into the storm season. And Mr. Henry, he brings with him years of experience, both working on the insurance side as well as the contracting and construction mitigation. His team here in South Florida has been helping business owners and community associations recover from loss and damage for more than 15 years. But however, like I mentioned, before he was a contractor, Henry was an insurance adjuster, and I had the sometimes unfortunate experience of dealing with him directly, mostly a pleasant experience. But Henry, you seem to know a thing or two about loss and damage, isn't that right?
That's correct. It wasn't that pleasant of an experience to me when I used to run into you.
Yeah, we definitely had our battles. It was definitely something I at times I think at first I didn't look forward to, but as I grew to know you and understand your position that you were taking, I felt like we were slowly building a bridge. And little did I know that it would lead us to working so closely together on the same side in the future. So. But you've obviously, WRG has an incredible reputation here in South Florida as a leader in the mitigation industry. Obviously, there's a lot of companies that our clients and many policyholders get to choose from daily. But I definitely see WRG as a leader, certainly setting that precedent. So what's it been like out there? First, we had COVID, then we had our now 2 hurricanes. And the floods just recently. What are you seeing?
Yeah, I mean, it's when we look at COVID, we kind of see it kind of like a hurricane. You start having all kinds of companies popping up everywhere that have never been in the business, and now all of a sudden they're cleaning experts, so it's been kind of tough in that sense, to see customers having to see many companies come into their building, companies with no experience, and it makes it hard to compete when you have companies that are going to charge very little money to get work done. Besides that, I mean, just working in general in a building, as you may already know, accessing the building is a little different nowadays, if it's even allowed. With the social distancing, it's just a lot more time consuming to get any job done at this point.
Yeah, no, I mean, Miami, we got hit with 9.5 inches, Broward 12 inches, with averages between 5 and 6, respectively. We saw tornadoes in different parts of the country, and obviously the hurricane just came ashore in the Carolinas. These things continue to roll in, and it's devastating. And I think access was always a hot topic since the onset of the COVID. Certainly, increasingly becoming more and more difficult. And I know that you've had a lot of recommendations to associations on how to handle those things, who the professionals really are, and what sets WRG apart from those other companies that are now jumping into the business. Right before the broadcast, we even had an opportunity to talk about these recent influx of companies offering cleaning service on a month-to-month, and how we'll just kind of there's always winners and losers, and we'll kind of see where that heads to, and hopefully we have some honest business owners entering the industry to help out with the typical day-to-day cleaning. But that's different than what you guys do, isn't that correct?
Yep, that's correct. When this first started, I mean, we looked at it more. We do a lot of environmental work, so we looked at this as an opportunity to help clients, because we knew clients are going to need help at this point. With the scare and all that stuff, not knowing what to do when you have someone infected in the building. So we looked at it, as an opportunity to help. At this point, people have, with all these webinars that you've been doing and many other companies have been doing, they've been getting more educated, and now it's a little bit more calm. So now they can make better decisions. So we're glad that's happening at this point.
And so Henry, why are people calling WRG, and what sets WRG apart from its competition?
Well, I mean, obviously, I'd like to say that our work is top notch in that sense, but I don't like to focus on the actual work. Extraction and drying up equipment and tearing out drywall. It's something anybody can do. I would say it's mostly the relationship management. How we focus on that relationship, not on the dollars at stake, but on that relationship. So we'd like to think that when you have a flood or you have one of these issues, that by calling us, you're taking one headache off your plate. So that's what I tell my people: take the headache off their plate, handle it, and as much as they want us to handle. If they want us to get involved with you when you're handling the claim, or get involved with the insurance adjuster, we'll be happy to do that, and I use my insurance background to do so. So I think it's just from start to finish type service.
Yeah, and you mentioned COVID, and obviously we're still dealing with it. We're not out of the woods on that issue. And I've had the opportunity to share the stage with you with a few of these webinars and talk a little bit about how we are all responding differently. But walk us through that process now. You have a flood loss. Your building is substantially damaged. What are you doing in this COVID world differently than you would otherwise done to obviously help and protect?
Yeah, I mean, in a flood, I mean, we have to, first of all, there's already the rules and guidelines that you already know about, so we have to follow that. And then you have each building with their particular rules. So we have to follow, so I can't tell you we do this in every single building, but every single building is going to have their unique rules and regulations that they want us to follow. So we have to adhere to that. And when you're dealing with floods in general, I mean, it's considered dirty, dirty water, because it's coming, from the ground, and it's mixing with petroleum, with oil, with whatever it may be. So we got to protect our workers in that sense. With regards to the COVID, again, we just have to follow the government regulations. We got to wear personal protective equipment way more than we used to. And then on top of that, we got to see what each building wants us to do to protect their residents.
Yeah, and part of our advice here at Global Pro is about building that cost into the actual cost of mitigation. It's not something separate. It's just that's the standard practice procedure at this point. We're seeing insurance companies, like we sometimes do with mold. When you have a water loss and you have consequential mold, insurance companies work overtime to try to create this whole separate claim for it. But the fact of the matter is that it's just a part of the protocol in order to fix those things. And it's important that our listeners and understand that it should be incorporated into the cost of the mitigation, not something separate and apart, so it can be recoverable.
Sure.
And that's obviously an important takeaway.
Sure.
For WRG, we're not even to June 1st, right? We're sitting here still in May. Two storms. We had this major storm that just rolled through here. We had, let me correct my statement, with 2 hurricanes. We had a major storm that just rolled through here, dumping an enormous amount of rain, causing a tremendous amount of flooding. What are your top storm prep recommendations for 2020 as we head into the actual storm season on June 1st, 2020?
Okay, yeah, I have a few things to say there. I mean, planning, right? Planning is everything. And what comes with planning is, who are you going to call when your building suffers a loss? Your whole staff needs to be on board. It can't be the maintenance guy calling one person, the manager calling somebody else, and the valet calling somebody else. You got to have a plan in place about who's going to get the call.
Point of contact.
Everything for water mitigation service, for your services, whatever it may be, the staff needs to be on the same boat. Agreements, have agreements with these vendors before the storm. Don't wait to the storm to start seeing what vendors are going to charge you. Sometimes during a hurricane, companies like ourselves find ourselves trying to bring in equipment from out of state or whatnot, and some additional costs might be involved. But why don't you get those taken care of before the storm? the agreements as far as payment terms. Get all this stuff agreed to before the storm. And then on the flood side of the claim, it's very important that customers know flood claims are so different than your regular pipe burst and that kind of stuff. And the flood, and obviously, I'm sure you'll talk about this, but my advice is definitely on the flood claims, you're going to need representation because they handle claims way differently than the rest, and they're very limited as to what they want to cover and not cover.
Yep.
And you want to have somebody there who says what they need to say and not say the wrong stuff that the insurance company is going to grab onto that and find a way to deny your claim. So I see that happening a lot. And finally, in floods, just please be careful with your staff. Don't have your staff taking water out of elevator pits and that kind of stuff. It's very, very dangerous situations.
And you mentioned to me on a call we had regarding a mutual client about waiting sometimes is a better practice when it comes to these floods. Talk to me a little bit about that.
Yeah, we find that when these garages get flooded, naturally you have a lot of pressure. The managers have pressures from everywhere, right? You have all the unit owners, you have the board members, you have everybody screaming at them that they want this water out of the garage. But what I like to tell them is, it takes, first of all, let's let the water recede. I mean, just imagine if the streets are flooded, it's coming into your garage. Where are you pumping that water out to? To get rid of it. Some people say, I need you to pump it outside of the garage. Well, that water is coming right back into your garage. First of all, after the street water has receded, still you got to give it some time, because otherwise you're going to spend tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of dollars getting water out of a garage, and then there might be coverage issues, and that's something you can discuss with the customers. But it's better to let it recede to a manageable level, to where then you can just get some pumps and get the water out of there more quickly and efficiently. But stay calm.
Stay calm, have the right people, have the agreements, agree on some pricing. And I don't want our listeners to confuse the idea of waiting with not doing anything. It's not the idea that they shouldn't do anything. It's that you have so much water coming at you that anything you're doing at that point regarding pumping or doing certain type of mitigation may be useless, because you may just be creating an enormous bill for yourself that may or may not be even recoverable. Right. And obviously you need an expert to review the policy to understand that sort of thing. But I think that's an important takeaway, is to understand how to, with proper planning. And I think that's the important message here, is proper planning and having a plan of attack ahead of time from start to finish is always going to be something very important for all of our community association managers, because the one thing that I see a lot of managers not do well with following a disaster is managing their own time. They end up running around with their heads cut off, making a lot of rash and decisions, not having zero patience. And I know you've experienced a bit of that, because we've shared some of our experience in that. Well, Henry, I wanted to thank you for joining us today. We truly appreciate your time. Certainly, Water Restoration Group, leader in the mitigation industry. Why don't you provide our audience some information about how they can contact WRG in the event that they do suffer loss and damage?
Yep, our phone number is 305-661-2533, or if you want to dial 844 dry water.
And you can visit them online at the waterrestorationgroup.com to obtain additional information. And I encourage all of you to reach out ahead of time. We just had those floods, June 1st, hurricane season 2020. So best advice we can possibly give you is practice preparedness. Again, Henry, thank you so much for joining us. And we're going to continue on with our broadcast, so stay tuned. We're going to hit into our inform, educate, and update you on all kinds of information that you can use as property management business owners as we head into the storm. Again, Henry, thanks again for joining us here for our broadcast.
Thank you for having me on.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, I want to update you on some of the important insurance trends that are hitting us here pretty hard in the South Florida area, as well as along the East Coast. When as we experience these floods, we're seeing a tremendous amount of changes in the way in which insurance companies are responding, and some of those changes include the way in which we're purchasing and acquiring new insurance, and the way in which insurance companies are responding to loss and damage as it relates to recovery, and advice that they may be giving you when you're experiencing the damages. But as it specifically relates to flood insurance, as a reminder, there's major changes that occurred in late 2019, and then following the first quarter of 2020 in early April, we saw significant changes to our premiums, where there was actually dramatic increases, 5 to 15% across the board, and as it relates to flood, we're seeing rate increases, policy changes, but it's not exclusive to flood, because we're seeing the same as it relates to your other coverages. But it's very important as it relates to flood that you pay close attention to the flood maps as you acquire new business, as you acquire new property or assets, or something changes about your business, is to ensure that you actually have the proper coverage and you're paying a market price for it, and it's pursuant to actually flood mapping. It's very important that you do take the time to review the proposals that are getting submitted to you by your brokers and understand that they are written properly, that the base flood elevation, that's something you want to look for. The BFE is properly recorded. If there's questions about it, if you've changed your property in any way, possibly even needing of a new survey or whatever it may be to identify where the base flood elevation is in your property, it's really important. And what that is measuring the lowest point of that property, and usually has a lot to do with the rating. They are constantly revising these maps. So we want to make sure that all of you are paying very, very close attention to what it is that your insurance companies or your brokers are providing you, and how they are insuring your business and your community association. So again, pay close attention to the zone. Also check the BFE. The last bit of advice as it relates to flood would be contents. A lot of people opt out of content coverage if it's available. And I would tell you that is an incredibly huge mistake. I would say one of the worst flooding disasters where I saw an issue of contents become a real pivotal point between a business or a community association being able to get back to business and not, was after Superstorm Sandy in the Northeast. For whatever reason, we found an amazing amount of policies that did not actually have contents coverage, but did have building coverage. And a lot of people said, "Oh, it was a savings issue," and I would tell you that, think twice about it. So look closely at the zoning, look at the mapping as it relates to what flood zone you are. Double check on that BFE, the base flood elevation, and if you can afford it, obtain that contents coverage. I can tell you that it saved a lot of businesses and community associations from either going out of pocket tremendous amount of money, having to borrow, or if for community associations aspect, they're having to special assess, which is just further burdening your unit owners. And it's almost like kicking a can. So let's try to avoid those things by thinking about those things ahead of time. In other news, the lawsuits continue to roll in. The opinions continue to follow as it relates to a lot of this COVID pandemic related losses that tremendous amount of businesses suffered, that took hold of our economy and our community in mid-March. So, and one of the cases that we want to highlight today is Primetime Sports Bar versus Lloyd's of London. The motion to dismiss was filed by Lloyd's. We highlighted that in a prior broadcast. We had immediate opinions from the defense side as it relates to how applicable it was. And now we've seen the other side of the argument, and the other side of the aisle say that they got it wrong. And I think there's a lot of justification to the basis for that, and confusion over what constitutes an actual tangible loss, like losing employees, losing vendors, losing access to property, how these things are actually physical in nature or tangible. And to summarize a very complicated and argument made by a lot of lawyers. Again, not a legal opinion, not a lawyer, but I'm just looking at this from a lay perspective, like most of our policyholders out there tuning in today, and most of the policyholders that we help on a routine basis. The bottom line is that the major takeaway is that if you have suffered some sort of loss, whether it's you no longer can provide certain services, your employees are no longer there, your clients are no longer coming to your place of business as intended, they physically cannot go there. The argument is that, in a nutshell, that you do have a tangible loss. And certainly that is a major takeaway. But the reality of it is that if you're not an expert, you only know what you know. So feeding into your insurance company's line of questioning when they're contacting you, or asking you for recorded statements, or they're just wanting to discuss and get feedback from you as to what your losses are, I would encourage you to only provide that information for which you know to be true. The reality of it is that most policyholders out there don't understand how words are given their meaning in the context of the policy. So it's important that you steer clear of trying to make assumptions regarding what you are or aren't covered for. So if they do contact you and ask you questions concerning your loss, they may try to lead you down a path where they're trying to say or trying to insinuate that something like a broken window, or like fire damage, something got burned, is only physical damage. And I'm telling you right now that there is arguments to the contrary, that that your employees can physically not come to work, or your property cannot be used as intended in and itself is physical, is tangible, and can possibly constitute physical or a physical loss to your property, and therefore trigger all of the applicable coverages available to you. So again, these are the arguments being made, and these are the things that we're seeing play out in court. And let's just remember where we started here, and I constantly want to remind all of us as we head into storm season and learn from our prior mistakes, is that we started in a place where insurance companies told us that these things were not covered. We just saw, if you're not tracking these things, if you are a business owner, I totally encourage you to do that. But in France, the courts come down and order one insurance company to go ahead and pay, and the insurance company said hourly that they were going to go ahead and honor those claims where the language is ambiguous in the policy, and provide coverage for losses to businesses, specifically, more specifically in their restaurant program. There is an expectation the same will happen here in the United States. But again, it could be a jurisdiction to jurisdiction thing. So you got to be careful as to what information or where you're going for that information. We're going to constantly be reporting those things here. So we encourage all of you to continue to tune in on a weekly basis to our broadcast to provide you the information that you can use to help your business or community association recover from any loss or damage. And as it relates to COVID, and this pandemic that we more recently experienced, the issues are continuing to evolve. The arguments are being made on both sides of the aisle. So right now, what we're seeing is a strong case being made for coverage. We do see that there are many policies out there that don't exclude any sort of loss or damage as it relates to virus, even virus. If they want to call it virus, if they want to call it pandemic, those words just don't appear in a policy. And we have sometimes we have these insurance companies representatives that may try to pervert certain provisions of the policy, like your duty to cooperate and demand a recorded statement, even though your policy doesn't actually include such terms and conditions in it. So let's talk about the legislation. There's definitely a rollback, but understand that as things roll back, it's going to muddy the waters as it relates to, and the pun is intended, muddy the waters as it relates to future claims, because trying to determine where your loss and damage started, and where your period of restoration, as most business owner policies state, ends, is going to become important to determining the amount of your loss and damage. We've learned from past experience, when there's been multiple storms back to back, what kind of confusion that can create and delays it can in the claims process. Not because it's intended on behalf by the policyholder to delay it in its reporting, but because the insurance companies will use that as a reason to extend their investigation and make further determinations as to what you are or are not entitled to. So it's really important that you come to conclusions as it relates to the beginning and end of your period of restoration and your entitlements to recovery. Most policies do include a 72-hour waiting period, which is basically your deductible as it relates to your business interruption or income losses. So make sure that you account for those things if it's relevant and included in your policy. But start to understand and analyze where you're turning the corner here and getting back to business as usual, so you can kind of determine where your business as usual or your period of restoration has ended, and where your business as usual has began. It's important distinction, and it's something to make sure that if you do experience a loss in the future that is recoverable and you do have income coverage for it, that you can separately distinguish that from those damages caused by the pandemic. And why that's going to become important to some business owners is that they may not have coverage, and it may be found that in their jurisdiction that they don't have coverage for their loss and damages under their policy for the pandemic related claims. So and it's important that you understand where you began and end, because like we saw with prior losses, or where you have a flood and a hurricane, sometimes the insurance companies like to take the position that maybe they're indistinguishable and therefore not covered, or they may try to use one that's not covered against you so that they don't have to pay for the one that is. So it's important that you analyze those things. It's important that you go through the exercise of understanding that concept, and that you come to some realization as to what you can or can't get paid for. So I want to talk about in our education section about should the recovery money owe to you, and should you start to rebuild? Okay, so you get the recovery money, and now you want to rebuild, right? Well, that's how it should happen. But what's actually typically happens for a lot of our policyholders is that they want to rebuild before they recover. So in this educational portion of our broadcast today, we want to talk about pivotal issues as it relates to recovering money, the idea of recovering the money before you actually rebuild, and how that's important to the claims process and avoiding any sort of prejudice, okay? A lot of people confuse the concept of that. So we just got done talking about how an insurance company may be able to confuse the period of restoration, or when one loss ends and another one begins, and how you need to work as a policyholder to distinguish between those two to avoid any sort of prejudice, and how they may use that period of discovery, if you will, as a reason to delay any sort of payment for the claim that already happened. Okay. Now we're switching gears as we move into the educational portion here to talk about the period. Now that you are ready to rebuild, should you rebuild before you get paid? And I can emphatically tell you no. However, the reality of it is that you do have a duty and obligation to mitigate. And sometimes people confuse that obligation with actually rebuilding. The idea of mitigating is stopping a loss from getting worse, not from actually rebuilding. The idea of putting actually back the sticks and bricks that were damaged. Now, there's obviously a gray area, and that gray area is part of your mitigation. Is it helping offset any future losses that could have been avoided? And maybe that part of that mitigation is extra expense to offset what that claim may be. So you do have an obligation to try to mitigate not only your building damages, but also your income loss. And so in order to mitigate your income loss, you may actually need to rebuild some portion of your property. If you're not confused yet, then you obviously know more than most. But let me take you through that one more time and walk you through it slowly. So you have a duty and obligation to mitigate. However, don't confuse your obligation to mitigate with rebuilding. However, if you need to rebuild in order to mitigate your income loss, you need to take steps in order to actually mitigate any future income loss by doing things that may be extra expense to get back to some sort of business. Meaning, if you sold hot dogs in your gas station and you can go buy a hot dog rolling machine and sell hot dogs on the corner, that may constitute some sort of mitigation of your income loss, because you're selling hot dogs, and the cost of that hot dog rolling machine or the hot dog cart may actually be recoverable as part of your claim. So it's important to kind of think about things differently. However, we don't want to just start rebuilding, because your insurance company may argue prejudice that they haven't finished their investigation. So we like here at Global Pro like to go through efforts to try to get the insurance company to confirm that they have finished their physical inspection evaluation of damages at your property, and so that you can start to maybe rebuild in order to mitigate your income loss, and you can show and prove that you've complied with policy obligations. But again, that's not putting all the sticks and bricks back together, and that's for business owners. Now let's switch gears over to community associations for a second. For community associations, there's no sense of rebuilding until you've recovered 100% of your money. In fact, in most areas in which we practice and we represent community associations, you have a duty and obligation to fully recover money before you can actually rebuild. Because until you get paid that money, you have absolutely no idea how much money you have to spend on rebuilding. And if you start rebuilding utilizing reserve money or special assessments, you may run a loss on that claim because maybe something you're doing is not in fact determined. Maybe in fact something you're doing is determined to be not recoverable, or your insurance company for whatever reason does not want to pay the value in which you paid for those materials or labor. And so therefore you have a dispute over that and you may have a shortfall in your actual recovery. So to avoid all of that, really quick rule of thumb: you mitigate, you stop, you recover, you rebuild. Meaning you mitigate to stop the loss from getting worse, you stop, you adjust the claim, you get paid and recover the money entitled to you, then you rebuild. It's very simple. Mitigate, stop, recover, rebuild. And that's what we at Global Pro will help our clients on a daily basis do. We walk them through that entire process so that they never can argue prejudice. We want to make sure that you're complying with your contract obligations, but you're doing it in a reasonable way in order to protect your interest in the claim, as well as protect the interest of your other fellow unit owners or your business owners and partners. It's really important that you slow down and practice our rule of thumb, which is mitigate, stop, recover, then rebuild. All right. So, and I mentioned earlier in our broadcast something about recorded statements. We're getting a lot of requests as it relates to some of these pandemic related claims that we have reported for recorded statements. Very few commercial policies that are sold here in the United States actually require that a business owner submit to a recorded statement. And that's a very important takeaway, because the duty and obligation may not extend to actually submitting to a recorded statement if it's not explicitly stated within the context of the policy. So it's important that you ask questions of your insurance company when they make requests of you, or better than that, look at your policy. Do a quick search. If you got it in a PDF electronic form and you have one of the free software, many softwares online that lets you search through the form, look for a recorded statement. If not, typically look in your duties in the event of a loss section and scroll down through them and see if it obligates you to actually provide a recorded statement. And we're not saying don't cooperate. We're just saying make sure that you're only doing what you're required to do pursuant to the policy. And we don't believe that if it doesn't explicitly state that you have to submit to a recorded statement, that in any way that you are obligated to do so. Because the reality of it is that there's many policy forms out there that actually do require a policyholder to submit the recorded statement. And your insurance company chose to sell you a product that doesn't include it. And they had the chance to actually do that and include it, and they chose not to. So how can they then now obligate you to do it? And that's the important point of it. Again, you want to cooperate. It's not that you're refusing to provide it if it's not included in there. It's that you don't understand why you're obligated to do it if it's not actually explicitly included in there, and they had the opportunity to include it in your policy when they sold you the product. So think about those things. And again, giving a statement is very different than giving a recorded statement. And so you need to distinguish between the two. There's also something called an examination under oath, and we don't want to confuse that with a recorded statement or giving a statement. An examination under oath is a very technical issue, and something that most often requires the presence of an attorney, because the insurance companies typically will retain an attorney on their behalf and will bring someone in to record the actual statement. Usually something that's arranged at a court reporter's office or a law firm's office, where you sit down and actually submit to a list of questions related to your loss and damage. And that brings me to my last and final most important part as it relates to this and the claims process is ensure that those questions that they're asked are actually relevant to your claims process and in some way helping their investigation. Sometimes we see insurance companies go way above and beyond what may be relevant to your actual claim and start asking you all kinds of ancillary questions to things that truly are not helping their investigation. Again, you do want to practice this this overwhelming desire to want to cooperate. However, that also, you know, you don't want to prejudice yourself by submitting to things that you otherwise aren't required to do. And sometimes we do have insurance companies that go way above and beyond with their requests of you and burden you with making you submit to things that otherwise contractually you're not obligated to do. So again, if you are asked to do a record a statement, check your policy. If it's included in there, by all means, you're going to want to submit to that. We we absolutely encourage you to contact an expert or counselor as it relates to providing that statement if it is recorded, to make sure that you understand what you are submitting to. Get the advice that you need in order to protect your interests. We're available to you 24/7, 365 days a year. Our expert team understands what it is, what is required of you, and can walk you through the steps that you need to take in order to continue to protect your interests. So make sure you do those things. And as it relates to your damages, and if you have suffered flood damages out there, I want to talk a little bit about elevators. We have a lot of community associations, specifically in the South Florida area, that were recently damaged by flood. But on a routine basis, we see a lot of water damage, fires, and other types of losses damage elevators. And a lot of times, elevator contractors will run out of the gates and tell you that they can get out there and start to repair your elevator. And they usually give you phases, okay? And that's great. You know, you want the prompt response, you want the immediate response, you want to mitigate your damages. Remember? All right, mitigate, stop, recover, repair, okay? And rebuild. But we're not talking about modernization. And unfortunately, a lot of elevator contractors will include inside their contract documents that they submit to you as part of one of the phases in your recovery that they're going to modernize your elevator. A lot of times, though, when we start asking the elevator contractors about that modernization, it's nothing more than rebuilding. Okay. And it's putting you back to pre-loss condition and has nothing to do with modernization. So we want to make sure that you're getting the information you need, and making sure that the language included in those documents is actually correct and going to help you with your claim, because most insurance companies are not going to pay and don't owe for modernization unless it's some sort of building ordinance that requires it. And that would, and sometimes you may have coverage under ordinance or law for those things. But before you get there, you need to establish what your damages are now and today in order to restore the elevators to the pre-loss condition before you get to the modernization. So you don't prejudice any sort of portion of your recovery by confusing those terms, because a lot of times a modernization means something like improving it way beyond even ordinance or law, maybe getting some new tile in there or wall finishes. Those things are typically included in a modernization. So we want to make sure that you don't slow down or prejudice yourself in any way by including those things in what you're expecting the insurance company to pay you. So again, mitigate your damages, stop, recover the money that's entitled to you. But part of that recovery is making sure that you can prove what your damages are. And we want to make sure our elevator contractors are not including ancillary things that are non-recoverable, which will just simply delay the claims process themselves. And then as you get into the rebuilding phase, you can then decide if you want to additionally modernize the elevator, but you can't expect the insurance company to pay you something that they're contractually just not obligated to do. But it's important that you break down what otherwise may be included in that modernization, because some of that modernization may actually be due to building ordinance and therefore recoverable. All right, so that's really important issues that we hit on in the education section. As a quick recap, we talked about terms and conditions of the policy and your duties in the event of a loss. Our quick rule of thumb: mitigate, stop, recover, then rebuild. The idea of recovering is getting the money you're entitled to. It's not about putting back the sticks and bricks. That's in the rebuilding phase, and that only happens after you do recover the money you're entitled to. We talked about recorded statements, checking your policies, making sure that your policies include the requirement to submit to one. If they don't, start asking questions regarding this burden, this request by your insurance company, and why it's even necessary as part of their investigation. And then lastly, we talked about elevators and damage that may come to them, and looking at contract documents and making sure that it includes everything that is actually recoverable and excludes those things that you may decide to do later on to improve your situation that may not be covered by your policy. So that's important that you follow those guidelines. If you have any questions about that, obviously you can contact us at any time. Our expert team is standing by, ready to respond to any of your questions or concerns. And obviously, our team is actively out there in the community representing many community associations, business owners who have suffered recent flood damages, tornado, or hail, whatever the disaster may be, and assisting them with their recovery, making sure that they can rebuild properly from these disasters. We want to inform you about some recent stresses that we're seeing on the public and private sector as it relate to resources. In our earlier segment, we were interviewing Henry Dow with the Water Restoration Group. He made an important point regarding getting contracts and getting pricing from those contractors up front. And why that is so important is based on the recent disasters that we've had, we already saw a stress on resources in both the private and public sector. I was hearing from contractors in the private sector that were saying that they're running out of equipment and hoses and having to kind of manage their quotations and just really spreading whatever equipment out that they had or labor to many different properties in order to respond, because they wanted to lock up the contracts. But getting out there ahead of time and negotiating these contracts or mitigation contractors will require them to provide you sufficient and adequate manpower and materials at the time of need. So that's why it's really important that you think about these things as we head into the 2020 storm seasons on June 1st. Just kind of envision this was a practice section. This is these flood events that we experienced here, South Florida, and the tornadoes that they experienced elsewhere, and the various other damages that we're experiencing throughout the country as these storm systems move through the various areas. It's important, again, to make sure that you ahead of time not only look at what they're offering you, but focus on logistics. What are they doing when they get there on site? Henry touched a lot on what they're doing as far as protective gear and how in this pandemic world that we're living in now, additional steps that they're taking. So what is your contractor going to do when they get on site to help you mitigate, right? They're not there to help you rebuild. And that's really important as well. Review their contract documentation and make sure it doesn't also include rebuilding. They need to first mitigate, stop, recover the money that you're entitled to, and then you can start to rebuild. So ahead of time, start negotiating these contracts. Make sure you understand what they're going to be supplying to you, when they're going to be doing it, how they're going to be doing it. Understand the logistics of getting in and out of the building, and all those things are very important to how you're going to recover and then rebuild. All right. So, and I want to remind everyone that they can go onto our website, getglobalpro.com/resources, check out all of the great information that we have there. We're continuing to update those things. Click the download button. Check out the tips and preparedness that we have available to you there. A lot of really great information as it relates to disaster preparedness. We always tell our clientele constantly practice the preparedness that you need to in order to recover from your loss so that you have what it takes in order for you to properly rebuild. Go on our social media, check out our YouTube website. We're constantly going to be uploading these broadcasts of the Recovery Report live. We're bringing on all kinds of interesting people in various different industries. These experts are going to be providing you great advice as it relates to everything from mitigation of your damages to new zoning and laws that are changing every day. We have marketing professionals that are going to come on to help us and our business and our community rebound from this pandemic. We want to make sure that you have the information you need in order to rebuild from these disasters and prepare for what's to come. Because around the corner, we have June 1st, 2020, the start of the storm season, and we want to make sure that you have what you need in order to be able to recover and rebuild. So again, huge thanks to all of our attendees, our industry expert, Henry Dow from the Water Restoration Group, for joining us today. We appreciate you tuning in this week. Feel free to contact us anytime at 855-487-7475. That's 855-487-7475. Our expert team is standing by to help you, your business, your community association recover from any sort of disaster or loss. We want you to go online, follow us on social media, where you'll be able to get up to the minute information and stuff that you can really rely on and to help you and plan and recover from your loss and disaster. Thank you all for joining us here today. We'll see you all next week.